All right, thank you. Thanks for coming. It's never fun to talk about excessive debt or what to do. Never fun to talk to people like me and to Lee because we never show up anywhere unless the situation's really bad. But I could tell you we're just here on vacation, so it's just coincidence. So a little bit of background on how we got here, how Lee and I showed up here. It was in December. I was at a conference on the history of sovereign debt. We were talking at that conference about matters in the 1800s and the 1900s. Really, we were supposed to have some connection to the current European crisis, but most of us were talking about things that were very far from the crisis in terms of the actual data we were talking about. And after the conference, Alex and I were at the post-conference, was it mulled wine party?
Yes,
yeah, it was really
and I was
not
pulling
very
my
good
hair
mulled
out.
wine.
Situation
Maybe
is,
we had drunk too much, and he began to ask about the Cypriot debt contracts. And I had probably consumed far too much wine and told him that, like with Greece, which had perhaps the easiest contracts to restructure in the history of sovereign debt, the contracts that Cyprus had entered into, as best I knew, were the hardest to restructure that I had ever seen. Now, that wasn't quite true, but I was trying to give him a sense of the fact that the same solutions, just as a contractual matter, could not work. And we were just, I think all that we were talking about was, how did that come to happen? You know, who were the lawyers, who were the bankers? Why were we in that situation? But at the conclusion of that conversation, I told him, I said, you know, restructuring in the same way that happened for Greece is not going to happen, no matter what the economic situation is. And so Alex said, beg your pardon?
You were drunk.
Yes, I was drunk.
He always is.
Yes, but I'm not drunk today.
Yeah.
He didn't let me drink anything right now. So Alex said, you know, you should come and talk about this if you happen to be in Europe for other work. And so I said, fine, that's an easy thing to say. So we're here now, and we did more work on it. Before coming here, since we had to come and talk to you, we decided to look at it. And in particular, just to give you some background, we're not, at least I'm not, and I don't think Lee is, we're not here to say a haircut is good or bad, or whether restructuring is necessary or not necessary. That's not what we do. We're here to just sketch out what is possible in light of what people have been saying, particularly the banks and the press, about the current situation. And it's really the hypothetical scenario. So what we have been reading, if you've been reading the Financial Times or the Nomura reports or the Fitch reports, you know that what they've been saying with respect to the payments that are due immediately. So really the rubber meets the road in June and July, where there is approximately 2.3 billion euros that is due. Right? The maturities are coming due. It's a large amount, and I think there isn't enough cash to pay it. Foreign lenders or local lenders are not willing to lend that money as things stand now. So the question is, what do you do? The reports are saying there is only one option. And there is only one option for one reason, they say, is because that the contracts are too difficult to restructure. They're under English law, and they're too difficult to restructure. Therefore, the only option is a bailout, a full bailout, so that those can be paid. And that is essentially what I had told Alex in December over wine, that these are tough. And that is also what Greece did. So if you go back to the Greek restructuring, it was able to restructure its local law bonds incredibly successfully. But those foreign bonds, they've gotten paid in full so far. So we did work on this, and that's what I'm going to talk to you about. So bear with me. I hate PowerPoint presentations where you just have lines of text. They just put me to sleep. But I'm going to put up text, and I need you to follow along with me to see the implications of this. Now, the key question, assuming the scenario that we show up in May, well, preferably in April, we show up in April and the Troika says, you know, we're not quite so sure we're going to give you all the money. That our taxpayers don't like that idea. Let's say that is what they say. Now, it's not an impossible situation. Lots of countries have been in that situation, mostly vis-a-vis the IMF, where the IMF has said, look, we can't give you all the money. You figure it out with your private creditors. We'll give you some of the money, but after you figure it out with your private creditors. So that movie has played before and people have worked out a situation. But if you're in that situation, you have to figure out how to be able to go to the creditors and say, look, we can't pay you. You have to take less. Or better still, look, we'll pay you. We just can't pay you today. Give us the leeway to take the money 5 or 10 years down the road. Well, the problem is that creditors, if you have a lot of people who bought your bonds who live in the United States and are counting on a giant payment in June and July because they want to tell their investors and their funds that they made a huge return, well, they have no interest in taking a payment late. So you have to gently persuade them. And there are 2 ways of doing that. There is the ugly, brutal way. That's the one that I like, and so I'll talk about that. And then there is the beautiful, elegant way. And you can see the difference in the way Lee and I are dressed. We've worked together for a long time. I don't own a single suit. He, I think, only owns elegant suits.
He only owns one.
But we have different preferences for how things are done. So I will talk about the ugly way, but you got to follow along with me with the language to understand how this will work. And this is not all in the paper because we wanted to keep something special for you here. And then Lee will talk about the elegant way. Now the typical way, the typical technique that we have talked about for probably about a decade as the one way to do this is to use what are called collective action clauses. If you're in the sovereign debt world, if you've been watching the debt movie for the last decade, you think that's the only way. And it's very simple. It's just a provision in the contract that says if you can persuade 75% of your creditors to agree to the extension of maturities or the haircut or whichever option you want, then everybody else, all the people who don't want it, are crammed down. That's a simple sort of bankruptcy solution. Problem is, if people anticipate that you might want that. So the bonds for Cyprus have a provision like that. Let's say if you get 75%, you can reduce the amount. The Greek contracts had a similar provision, even a lower vote, I think, overall, if you went into the contract. But creditors, if they're smart enough and they have enough money, they figure out all they have to do is buy up 25% and they can block it. And so 17 of the 36 foreign law bonds for Greece, that's what they did. They said, sorry, we're not interested. We would prefer to be paid 100% than 30%. That's usually a calculation that people can make fairly simply. So then you have to figure out some other technique. Now just to make it clear, we're not talking only about the situation with the Cyprus foreign law bonds. Greece still has about, let's say, 5 to 6 billion. I know Lee cannot talk about this since he's working on it, but I can talk about it. They have about 5 to 6 billion of foreign law bonds that they still need to restructure. So Cyprus has about 4 high threes, as Fiona told us. So added up, it's about 10 billion that needs to be done, restructured. Right? So the traditional strategy, the traditional strategy that countries have used for hundreds of years is to say, take our deal, and if you don't take our deal, we just won't pay you. Sue us. We're a country. You can't effectively sue us. The problem with that strategy is that for the first time in the history of the sovereign debt markets, creditors have begun to be able to effectively sue. And that is what Argentina has faced. Creditors have been able to sue with great effectiveness, and I can explain this later if you want. Cyprus actually has the same provisions that got Argentina into trouble. So there is a real risk. If you don't pay, they will be able to effectively sue. So the ugly solution, I told you Lee would talk about the elegant solution. The ugly solution is to go into the contracts and figure out whether there's other stuff in the contract that would give you some kind of bargaining leverage to persuade these people to just wait a little longer to get paid. If you're in a situation, the first thing to do, one of these bad situations, the first thing you ask is somebody else going to be willing to give me money to tide me over? Now, if you're a corporate and you have good assets, Fiona says there's a lot of gas that you don't want to sell. Hypothetically, purely hypothetically, you have a lot of assets, what would you do? You would use them, you don't want to sell them, you'd say, look, give me a secured loan, and eventually, if I don't have enough money to pay you, I will pay you preferentially from those revenues. I'll give you a preference from those revenues. Ordinarily, in a sovereign bond, you cannot do that. And the reason is the old creditors would have negotiated for what some of you may be familiar with, which is a negative pledge clause. And the negative pledge clause says, if you give a preference, a security interest to somebody new, you've got to give us the equal preference. That's the standard negative pledge clause, which basically makes it impossible to give anybody a preference, because if you give everybody the same preference, nobody has a preference. So this, now I need you to read with me the text. This is the negative pledge constraint. I've simplified it. The Republic will not create any encumbrance, which is the preference, other than a permitted encumbrance, blah, blah, blah. So you're allowed to do a permitted encumbrance. So if I had my students don't like to read contracts, and that's what I teach them. I would scream at them, okay, now you've got to go read what a permitted encumbrance is. This is what the permitted encumbrance is. And please do not read down. Just read the top part. The permitted encumbrance means any encumbrance representing not more than 20% of the total assets of the Republic. Does anybody see the magic in this without reading down? You don't see it if you read it quickly. Okay, I'll walk you through it, just like my students. All right. Normally, there's a qualification. There are these extra words. It would say permitted encumbrance individually or in the aggregate. But here it doesn't say that. They left that out. That means so long as you give 5 encumbrances each of 20%, you can do 100% encumbrance. Well, that's wonderful. That means in your contract, the negative pledge doesn't really exist. You are not constrained. All right, I hope you see that, but I can come back to it. That is a tremendous tactical advantage. Because if you have to give, if you're trying to persuade somebody to stretch out your maturities, take their money late, what you would tell them is, look, I will give you a first priority on my wonderful gas revenues in the future. you will have a priority over everybody else. This allows me to do that. Whoever signs up for my new deal gets a preference over whoever does not sign up for my new deal. If this works well, nobody wants to be left behind. Everybody signs up for it. Everybody signs up for it. Well, none of them actually really get a preference, but everybody's happy. They do it voluntarily. All right. Now let's say you don't want to do that. I like that one. That's my favorite. That doesn't need anybody's help. Now the typical contract, if you read further into the contract, the typical contract has a clause that governs payments. That's the payment clause. Once again, bear with me. The payment clause, the typical payment clause that you see in to any applicable fiscal or other laws, regulations, and directives, and it would say in the place of payment. In the place of payment is usually Luxembourg or London. So typically, you just, whatever payments are subject to whatever Luxembourg or London would decide to do to you. Their local taxes, they need to apply something locally to take care of the transactions costs. But the Cyprus bonds, they say all payments are subject in all cases to any applicable fiscal or other laws, regulations, and directives. See what they left out? There's no in the place of payment. That means it's not Luxembourg or London law. It could be any law. My favorite is, it means laws of Cyprus.
Isn't the English law of the, let's say, documentation overruling that?
Oh, good question. Good question. Right? So the contract has a general provision that says English law. But this clause, as is read standard in every bond contract, is actually meant to override that by saying the laws of Luxembourg or London. So, that reading, and it is a good lawyer on the other side would raise that question. But this is as clear as you can get. Any. Right? All payments are subject in all cases to any applicable. You would have to make the argument that, I mean, what could be more applicable than the laws of Cyprus? And if you chose voluntarily, with fancy lawyers on the other side, to take out that language, surely you meant the laws of Cyprus. At least that's what I would say. All right, but let's say you don't like that either. I got one more, just one more, to show you how I was wrong, how wrong I was to tell Alex that there were no options. Right. So this is the solution. So because we have a lot of free time, we came up with what law Cyprus could pass. It would be, I'd pass a law saying all obligations are transferred to the central bank and maturities are extended for another 20 years at 2% per annum. Maybe a little unfair, but, So now in the contracts, every contract that a country signs, if you are any country but the AAA rated countries, the United States, Japan, Netherlands, France, everybody else has to sign a waiver of sovereign immunity. Meaning your creditors should have to be able to sue you in foreign courts. Otherwise they won't lend to you. Now these waivers of sovereign immunity sometimes have conditions on them. So when you sign it, you say, look, you can sue us and attach a bunch of our assets, but you can't, for example, get our military assets. Or you cannot, for example, take our embassy or the presidential plane. So Argentina did not have these exceptions, so the creditors, if you've been reading the paper, they've been chasing after
Ships.
Christina Kirchner's plane. They think it would be very nice and effective on the front pages of the newspapers to get her plane because she hasn't paid her bondholders. So let's now look at the language in the contracts that Cyprus has. So the typical immunity provision is very broad. The Republic waives immunity from suit and execution for everything. You can have everything. Lend us the money and you can have everything that we have. But in the contracts for Cyprus, there is this little exception at the end. And it says, the waivers do not apply to the Republic's property, and the property is described in 5 different ways. Do not apply, once again, let's read that again, because this is truly beautiful language. Do not apply to the Republic's property necessary for the proper functioning of the Republic. So creditors cannot get anything that is necessary for the proper functioning of the Republic. Now this is very good if you're a very small country,
Yeah.
because everything is necessary for the proper functioning of the Republic, right? If you like ice cream, your ice cream truck is necessary for the proper functioning of the Republic because it makes you happy. So feel free to sue. You can have all of our assets except for those that are necessary for the proper functioning of the Republic. Now, this is unusual. I don't think the next time around creditors will allow this in. But it is in all of the Cyprus bonds. So those people who are saying, as I said to Alex, that you're screwed, those bonds are really hard to restructure. Those people, like me, were not reading the language carefully. This is a big tactical advantage, but it's ugly, it's not elegant, it's not pretty. It will be challenged and countered. People will say, no, we did it by mistake, that's not what we meant. And they would be fair to say that. I think that it's kind of hard to argue with this. This was not a mistake, it was explicitly put in.
It's not very relevant, because if I am a creditor, I'm going to say, well, I'm going to take your gas. You don't need that. So.
Oh, I think I can make an argument that my gas revenues are pretty necessary for the proper functioning of the Republic. But you would have to fight me in court.
I would win.
You might, but it might take you 20 years, and by that time, right? So that's it. I want you to be in that situation, but I don't actually. What I want is for you to see this. I want you to see this and see the future, and decide that you would not want to be fighting me. All right? But the elegant solution I will leave to Lee, because this is the ugly solution.
Thank you, Mitu. And
so we put this. When we prepared this paper, we put it up online to get comments. And you can tell that people who held foreign investor hedge funds were not so happy with us because they were counting on, full recovery. So we got some reactions, and I've put up some quotes for you from emails I've received.
yeah. Yeah. I have to say, some journalists also were pretty hostile with these ideas. We seem to not like having options.